Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm Isabella Tabarovsky. I'm a senior advisor with the Kennan Institute. Welcome to our webinar. Excuse me for 1 second. Welcome to our webinar about how Russia's war in Ukraine is impacting indigenous communities in Russia. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to stay up to date with the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File. If you have questions for our speakers, you can submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. I also want to say before we start that we have one of our speakers will, and I will introduce our speakers in a moment, but one of our speakers will speak in Russian today. We are providing simultaneous interpretation. So if you plan to listen in English only, and in fact, I think everybody on the webinar should choose the interpretation function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Either you will see a globe or the word interpretation, or it may be hiding under more. So if you don't see a globe, look for it right now, go to more, and there you will see, you will be able to choose interpretation, and then you will be able to choose the channel that you want to listen on, English or Russian. And I think it's probably best for everyone to listen to the English channel. At least we've tested that, and that's what technically works. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. We're really honored to have Alexandra Garmazhapova with us, who is the founder and president of the Free Buryatia Foundation and an anti-war advocacy group. She's also a veteran investigative journalist and political researcher who has been advocating for human rights and democracy in Russia for over 15 years. And our second guest is Pavel Solenziga, who is a visiting scholar at Dartmouth College and president of the International Indigenous Fund for Development and Solidarity, Batani, which was founded to protect indigenous people's rights in Russia and around the world. So again, Pavel will be speaking in Russian, Alexandra will be speaking in English, I will be speaking in English, so please choose the English channel. And again, if you have questions for our speakers, you can submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom. Please include your name and affiliation when sending the questions. So with that, let's begin. Alexandra, please, the floor is yours for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, firstly, for invitation, Isabella and Kennan Institute. I would like to say about situation in Russia with ethnic minorities group. And firstly, we should understand that in Russia live about 200 ethnic groups. For example, the Buryats, whom I belong, number about 500,000 people in Russia. Buryatia is republic located in Siberia, bordering Mongolia. Buryatia has a diverse ethnic composition, 30% ethnic Buryats and 70% Russians, Ukrainians, and others. The war has certainly had an impact on indigenous people of Russia, as a high percentage of them participate in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Buryatia has many military units due to its strategical geographical location, close to China. So we should understand its remarks. Why are indigenous people involved in the war? Firstly, because of the big poverty rate, unfortunately, in the Russian regions, including the national republics. Secondly, because of the high level of propaganda. It's important to admit that the Kremlin's propaganda is very effective. They use different methods, attracting show business stars and religion figures, etc. For example, the leader of Russian Buddhists, Damba Ayushev, calls for Russian Buddhists, including Kalmyks, Buryats, and Tuvians, to participate in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because we should save our Mongolian world. And we should save Russian world. I don't understand why, where is logic, but it's true. It's his remarks. At the same time, the Dalai Lama has never called of Russian Buddhists not to participate in the war. I don't understand why, but it's true. In addition, a propaganda song appeared in Buryatia. Russians don't surrender. Buryats don't run. It's big narrative in Russia. It's multicultural, big Russian group. And inferiority complex may also play a role. Due to constant racist attacks in Russia, indigenous people are trying to prove to themselves and the world that they are as strong and influential as Russians ethnic. This is a trauma of colonialism, in my opinion, just. The Kremlin's official narrative in this war is multinational people in Russia versus the Nazis in Ukraine. In February 2022, Ukrainians were among the first to see soldiers from Buryatia, which gave them a negative perception of a particular ethnic group. In addition, this fit into Ukrainian vision of Russians' attack on it, an invasion of the descendants of the Ord into Kievan Rus. Kievskaya Rus, I don't know how to say. We know of a large number of Buryats who in the period from 2022 and 2024 don't want to participate in this war and crossed the border with the United States through the CBP-1 application and requested asylum in the United States. Now, some of them, despite legal entry into the United States, are being held in detention centers. Unfortunately, we cannot count on Mongolia, which in 2022 accepted residents of Buryatia fleeing mobilization, for which we are certainly grateful, but later it's ignored the order of the International Criminal Court and accepted Vladimir Putin. And now it's increasing joint economically beneficial project with Russia. And for example, last week, civil officers from Mongolia, they came to Buryatia, and governor of Buryatia came to Mongolia, etc. It's a big problem. Of course, we don't deny that ethnic Russians are also dying in this war, but there are more than 100 million Russians ethnic, while, for example, representatives of the indigenous small people, for example, the Yukagirs, are only 1,500 people. We shouldn't and we can't compare these numbers. In total, according to open data, more than 2,500 people have died from Buryatia as of today. This number includes both Russians and Buryats. We can't count, and we don't want to count separately Buryats and Russians, because we are foundation from Buryatia, and we should say about residents of Buryatia, doesn't matter ethnic groups. And my last point, for example, there are less than 1 million people living in Buryatia. To understand the scale of the losses, you need to know one fact. There are not a single resident of Buryatia who doesn't know at least one person who died in Ukraine. Why is Kremlin propaganda successful? It's just my humble opinion. It's very important to say. Because they know better those they work for. Western NGO and media often try to tell about LGBT and feminist agendas to audience in Russia that don't yet even understand why fair elections are important. As a result, ordinary people in Russia, in Buryatia too, think that human rights are about only LGBT and radical feminism. It's a big problem. People need to be explained how their lives and their standards of living are connected to human rights step by step. It's just my opinion, but it's very important because people in Buryatia, I want to say, don't understand what is human rights. Why the human rights connected with their level of life, with economy, with job of work of civil officers, governors, and members of parliament in Buryatia. That's all. Thank you.
Alexandra, thank you so much. Pavel, please, the floor is yours. Please give us your introductory remarks, and then we'll have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Isabella. First of all, let me thank you for the invitation, for this opportunity to tell about the situation that we have, about the impact of the war of Russia against Ukraine on the small indigenous nations of North Siberia and the Far East. I would like to say that overall on the list of small indigenous nations of the Far East and north of Siberia, there are 42 nations, but out of those 42, 7 groups have less than 1,000 people each, and for 12, it's less than 2,000 each. And among all of those 42 groups, none is bigger than 50,000 people. So when we discuss the impact of the war on all of these nations, let's start with the numbers of casualties. This information has been and is being collected by my colleagues based on obituaries that are published for fallen soldiers in local newspapers, in the local media, in local group chats on social media. Of course, those data are not complete, but they give you an idea of what's going on. And the first striking thing is the disproportionate number of casualties among small indigenous nations. The analysis of the double-checked data demonstrates that those small nations, such as Chukchas, Etelmen, Karaks, Nenets, Nganasans, Udege, Sami, and others, that they are disproportionately affected compared to Russian citizens overall. These small indigenous nations of the north are overrepresented, so to say, not only compared to the rest of Russia, but even compared to non-indigenous nations of the very same regions where they live. So I'd like to point out and give you the data that the biggest number, when we look at proportions, the biggest numbers are Telengaites, a group in the Altai Mountains. For Udege, it's 5.3. For them, it's 10 over 10. And overall, when you take Russia and Russians, you have 0.7 per 1,000. So you can see the numbers for small indigenous nations are much higher than for ethnic Russians and for Russian citizens. So in Khabarovsk region, as of April 2024, 80% of indigenous men were recruited during the so-called mobilization. There was information that appeared and then disappeared very quickly, but we had the data that in one particular village during that mobilization, the so-called partial mobilization, all of the adult men from 18 to 50 years old were recruited from this one village. So only children and old men were left in that village. The women, of course, made it a big news story, and of course, some men were given a chance to go back. So in the Khabarovsk region, during the mobilization, around 4,500 men were recruited. So the indigenous men of the Khabarovsk region were mobilized 3 times more often than the rest of the men. From late 2022, we can see that the mortality levels in some specific regions are way higher than everywhere else. and the men representing the indigenous nations in the Nenets region are the casualties among them are much higher than among anyone else. So in the Nenets region, we are talking mostly about the so-called volunteers or the prisoners who were recruited to go to war. So that's another sign, that's another proof that a lot of indigenous men are in prison. And in the meantime, the Nenets region is actually one of the more prosperous than Russian average because of the oil producing industry and the relatively low population. They're supposed to be more prosperous than Moscow on average. But unfortunately, this prosperity does not bring any benefits to the indigenous communities. The mineral extraction industries hurt the environment, damage the resources on which the indigenous communities depend. Poverty and imprisonment are the most significant factors affecting the men of those regions, and that's what makes them overrepresented among the so-called volunteers in this war. The Russian propaganda, when they listen to our presentations, they always refer us to the legislation of the Russian Federation that supposedly protects the ethnic minorities, but it's all a lie. According to our data, not a single representative of indigenous nations had a chance to rely on this legislation to protect themselves. In actual fact, we can see that they are forcibly mobilized to this war. I would like to tell you the story of an Evenk man whose name is Pahomov. He's from the Sakha-Yakutia Republic. He hunted for a moose, and he was doing that for his family, to feed his family. He was caught with a killed moose and detained. So everyone assumed that he will be punished, but maybe he will be fined for illegal hunting. The meat of this moose was disappeared, probably stolen by the policeman who detained Pahomov. Authorities of his region did try to protect this hunter, but the prosecutor general was really forceful here and he was imprisoned. They also claimed that he was keeping his gun illegally, although his gun was perfectly legal, but there was a criminal case against him. He was supposed to submit his gun to the authorities. He was a bit late with that, so they used this to imprison him. And this whole story started before the war, before the full-scale invasion. So it went on and on. In 2024, Pahomov went to prison. From prison, he applied to go to war, but we all know how those applications work. And in December 2024, he went missing in this war. And let me give you another story. This one is quite old, maybe 20 years or so. While I was still in Russia, we did research focusing on several villages of indigenous communities. And in one Evenki village in the Amur region, during our research, there was not a single man over 18 years old who had never been on trial. All of the men over 18 years old had been on trial at one point of their life or another, and most of them for illegal hunting. So let me now explain the reasons why the representatives of small indigenous nations of the North go to prison. And the primary reason is poverty, extreme poverty. So in the Nenets autonomous region, we can see that even though the region itself is prosperous, rich in natural resources, but the indigenous communities remain in deep poverty. The second reason is criminalization of their lives. Indigenous nations lose their lands. Officially, those lands do not belong to them. But of course, those people go on fishing and hunting because they need to feed their families. And so then they go on trial for illegal hunting or fishing. Unfortunately, they also have problems with alcohol consumption. So a lot of crimes are committed because of that as well. So those are the primary reasons. The third reason is the vulnerability of small indigenous nations. Because they are generally very law abiding. They live in small villages, very far from big cities. It's easy to get hold of them. That's what we saw during the so-called partial mobilization. In the villages, they were caught, they were taken from home, they were subpoenaed and taken to this war. Reason number 4, and Alexandra mentioned that, unfortunately has to do with the Russian propaganda. 24/7, you keep hearing all of this, and not everyone can tell the truth from the lies. Not everyone among the small indigenous nations have internet access, so that's another reason. And the final one I would like to mention, and very few people mention it at all, it's the complexes that the indigenous nations have. And it has gone on since the Russian Empire. It's the legacy of colonialism and chauvinism. And this minority complex that they have affects them. Now that they have a chance to go to war together with others and prove that we are the same as you, we are not worse than you in any way, it also has an impact. And the final thing that I would like to say is that the destructive impact of the number of casualties and the disproportionate mobilization, the way it all affects the minorities of the north of Russia, will feel it for years and years and for generations. If this trend persists, entire indigenous nations and cultures will be on the brink of extinctions within a few generations. Thank you very much.
Pavel, thank you very much. And I want to thank my colleague, Nina Rozhanovskaya, who is doing such an excellent job of interpreting for us today. Thank you very much, Nina. So I want to ask Alexandra, and to remind our listeners, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll look at them and pose them for our speakers. Alexandra, I want to ask you, why has there been so little protest in Buryatia, despite the high death toll, despite the disproportionate mobilization? Why are we not seeing any protest movements?
I think, thank you for the question, but I think in Buryatia situation similar like in other regions, because we don't have freedom and conditions for protest. For example, I live abroad. I live in Europe, but I was sentenced to 7 years in prison for fake news about Russian army in absentia, fortunately. But because I gave only one interview to Ukrainian channel. I think we understand for this case about repressions in Russia and in Buryatia, including too. Two weeks ago, Natalia Filonova, former political prisoner from Buryatia, and she left prison after more 2 years in prison, because she has anti-war position. And she participated on protests in Ulan-Ude, and after, according version by police officers, she had conflict with police officers, and she beat 4 police officers, but she is 63 years old. And she is not young woman, and how she could beat 4 police officers? It's stupid situation. It's not true. But she was in prison almost 3 years. It's a real situation in Buryatia, and we know one case how one woman, she was repressed too, and she paid, I don't remember how much, but she paid money to Russian state because she liked our post by our foundation, just like, and she has case about discreditation of Russian army, and people afraid. Firstly, yes, we have big propaganda, unfortunately, and secondly, people afraid. And you can imagine how, for example, you are just a person, you are against war, and you live in Buryatia, and you are feeling that people around you and they support this war. And you understand that they are like enemies for you, and you are enemy for this group too. And we have in Buryatia a lot of people who lost their relatives in Ukraine, and son and brothers and fathers, etc. People, for example, just mother who lost her son in Ukraine, and she wanted to believe that her son died for big idea, for our country. And propaganda said her, yes, it's true. Your son was hero, and your son defend, protect our big and great country. And it's a difficult situation for people who has anti-war position in Buryatia. And if you live not big region like St. Petersburg and Moscow, you understand you are more visible for police officers and for another people, for others. And you couldn't hide with your position, and you couldn't find your friends with one position, people another. It's difficult, and I really try to support people from Buryatia who have anti-war position, because very often I have messages from Buryatia from villages. It's very important, not only from capital of Buryatia, Ulan-Ude, from villages. And for example, one teacher, she sent me a message, oh, I live in a village, I'm teacher, but I'm trying to give to my children in the school normal values about human rights, etc. But I'm afraid, because maybe some child can say to her or his parents about my position, it's dangerous for me. And I think we should understand this context. In St. Petersburg and Moscow, it's more safe for people, but it's not real safe, because it's a Russian Federation and Putin's Russia. It's a big problem for Russian citizens.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. We have a question from Dmitry Berezhkov. I think, Pavel, it will be for you, because I know that you participate in a lot of UN expert groups. So the question is, why is the topic of war and its catastrophic impact on the rights of indigenous peoples in both Russia and Ukraine, for example, Crimea, not covered in the reports and presentations, or covered in very fragmented way of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, despite the fact that both mechanisms have representatives of indigenous peoples from either Ukraine or Russia. I think, Pavel, what do you think from your experience? What is your sense of that?
You know, I think there is a very simple answer to this question. Russia promotes its interests and its propaganda not just within its borders, but at the international level. And the influence of the Russian government within the UN system is extremely large. There are representatives of indigenous nations who represent Russia in the UN system. They have been elected to represent indigenous nations. In principle, according to their mandate, they are there to protect the rights of indigenous communities, but they're completely subject to the Russian government. I can offer you two names, people who are very active in promoting the Russian narratives, the Russian propaganda. For instance, Ms. Gorbunova, she's an expert within the UN mechanism. She always introduces herself as an international expert, but she used to work for RIPON, which is an organization of indigenous nations in Russia that was taken over. It only now engages in propaganda, and this organization supports the war in Ukraine. And Ms. Gorbunova now also works for another so-called indigenous nations organization, KMNS Union, which is completely funded by Nornickel company. It gets 100% of its funding and the salary from Nornickel. And Nornickel is one of the companies that funds the propaganda at the international level. And so all of our proposals, our reports, which we also have presented, and we did our best to convince the expert mechanism representatives to include the true stories about what is going on to indigenous nations in this war and how they're impacted and the negative impact. All of this was rejected. Research has been done all over the world. Research on the war of Russia against Ukraine, all of it was rejected. None of it made it into the report. They only included the proposals suggested by the Russian government. There is another person, Alexei Tsikarev, quite well known in the movement of indigenous nations. He was a representative of Russia in an expert mechanism. He was the member of the Permanent Forum in the UN, but he works for the Russian government. At the international level, he promotes the interests of the Russian government. He always speaks about how wonderfully Russia protects the rights of indigenous nations. That there was, for instance, the so-called Year of Indigenous Nations and Languages spoken by them. You see, that's how things are great in Russia. And he would give an example of the US as a contrast. Look how much money Russia gives, and look, US doesn't provide that much funding. Although he knows very well that in the US, much more money is granted for various indigenous causes. It simply comes from different sources. It goes through universities and different Native American colleges. So those people are there to basically suppress the criticism. And I do have to apologize, but Mr. Tsikarev was a fellow at the Wilson Center some time ago as a representative of an indigenous nation. We know, unfortunately, Russian spies, Russian agents are plentiful there everywhere. So So nothing goes through. Our proposals do not go through. When we have a chance to present at the UN platforms, the Russian government calls us enemies. They say we do not represent anyone. They say that we engage in illegal activities. So unfortunately, the Russian government successfully promotes its propaganda, and it does reach quite far.
Thank you so much, Pavel. Alexandra, I have a question for you. What would you say, what can we understand from the way that the state treats Buryatia? What can we understand more generally about the broader center-periphery dynamics in Russia's kind of political system? Because when you and I talked a couple of days ago, we discussed how Russia really targets regions, right? Poorer regions, because there is less maybe chance of protests, etc. What can we understand from the Buryatia example about this broader dynamic?
Maybe you heard one news, unfortunately, how in Russia federal authority is trying to kill municipal level. It's true. Now we don't have federation, but our authority are trying to make new tools and new methods how they can kill federalism in Russia. But it's strange that Russian federation is federation, but it's not in factly. And I think Buryatia is ordinary region in Russia. We have a lot of poor regions, and for example, Pskov region. And we know in Bucha, unfortunately, soldiers from Pskov, and they made terrible things. Maybe do you remember this moment? And it's about poor regions, how they try to make money now in this situation. And for example, some people in Buryatia and women who lost their husbands, they now have good cars, for example, and they have good life, and because they have money after death of their husbands, and maybe they are glad. I don't know, but it's true, and it's about situation with economics. And economics, unfortunately, in Buryatia now is maybe better than before this full-scale invasion. It's absurd situation, but it's true. And now we have just one moment very important for me, and very important to say that we like to discussing about bad ethnic Russians and colonialism and imperialism by Russian people, but governor of Buryatia and Alexei Tsedenov, he is Buryat, and he doesn't speak Buryat language, but he sent a lot of people to Ukraine for this war. And general military prosecutor in Russia, I think his name Valery Petrov. Yes, Valery Petrov. He has Russian name, but he is Buryat. And we should understand that now we have problem with very poor regions. We have problem because we don't have federation, and these regions only they very, very strongly depend on Moscow. And they depend on Moscow about money, about power, about some tools for their life. And we should say about multicultural Russian elites who are against Russian regions. It's very important to understand, because do you remember we had Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu. He's from Tuva, and now we have General Prosecutor Military. He's from Buryatia, etc. And Elvira Nabiulina, she's from Tatarstan, etc. And it's I think it's a result of colonialism. And we should understand, and we should say it's war against Ukraine. It's colonial war, imperial war, because official real narrative by the Kremlin that Ukraine is not independent country and state. Ukraine is part of Russian Empire. It's reason why we defend our country in Ukraine, because Ukraine is part of Russia. And I think we should say more about this moment than we heard, unfortunately. But I'm so sorry. We should say about this moment with what we think about Donald Trump. And when we said before Donald Trump's administration this narrative about imperialistic war, about colonialism, this now situation between Ukraine and Russia, but now our opponents very often responded. Oh, what do you think about United States? Maybe United States now, they want to occupy of Ukraine. It's colonialism too. And unfortunately, now we don't have a real answer for this question. And I don't know how we can respond for this take. And maybe you know how, but I don't know. Thank you.
Alexandra, thank you so much. We have a question from Dmitry Valuyev, which I think maybe both of you will want to answer. So Nina will probably want to translate it for Pavel. So he's asking, what is the current relationship between Russia's pro-democracy and anti-war civil society and the indigenous peoples of Russia, including those in the North, Siberia, and the Far East? So who would like to?
I think maybe better than Pavel is first and I second.
Okay. Pavel.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to say that this relationship cannot be called good, so to say, but I do believe that we need to keep looking for ways to collaborate between the representatives of indigenous communities who consider the Putin regime a terrorist regime that destroys indigenous nations, and on the other hand, the pro-democracy and the opposition movements of Russia. We, and I'm speaking here on behalf of the indigenous nations, in April, we are holding the first meeting of the indigenous nations of the Russian North and the Far East and Russian opposition and pro-democracy organizations. It will be held in the United States. It will be held in the lands of Lamy in the Washington state, an indigenous nation land of the United States. And I do hope that it will be the first step towards cooperation, but not the last one. I do believe it's important for all Russians to unite, for all Russians who fight this regime, in order to fight together and maybe try to fix things together. I would like to emphasize that right now the relationship is a difficult one, but I do hope we'll keep making steps towards each other.
Thank you, Pavel. Alexandra, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, it's a very difficult question for me because I was born in Buryatia, but I grew up in St. Petersburg. And I try to be like a bridge between center and regions. And sometimes I think they use one language, but they use different things. Because very often they don't understand each other. I think it's normal because they had different experience. It's very important because people, pro-democratic people, anti-war people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, very often they didn't have experience of racism, for example. And they don't understand what indigenous people want because they don't look problem, don't see problem because and they think that it's just separate cases. It's not a real situation in Russia. And I'm trying to explain this problem to Yayashin, to Vladimir Karamurza, and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, because I keep in touch with these people, and I have this opportunity to say about this problem directly. But sometimes I'm feeling that they don't understand, and I think we couldn't be lazy, and we should explain. It's normal that people don't understand because maybe we have discussion now about feminism and female rights. And it's a difficult discussion for me because I didn't have problem with my gender. And very often I don't understand what women want. But I know some feminists who are ready to explain me why this cases is not good, it's not okay. Some cases. I think we should try to work together, but I think we understand together problem of racism, because this war against Ukraine is very strong connected with racism. This arrogant attitude to Ukraine from Putin, for example, by Putin. And Putin likes to say, Ukraine is not state. Ukrainians, they are not independent, separate nations. They are bad Russians. Ukrainian language is not real language. It's bad form of Russian language. It's racism and chauvinism. And we should understand this. And it's answer why, when I started to give first my interview to Ukrainian channels, I'm always said instead hello Russian version, Добрый день, I prefer to say Ukrainian language. And I said goodbye in Ukrainian language. It's very important for Ukrainian people because you respect their language, their culture, their state. And I think people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, they don't understand very often why it's important. And they don't understand why we are indigenous people and we are Buryats and another people don't like form Ruskiye. You know, in English, we don't have another form, only Russians. But ethnic Russians or Russians as citizens of Russian Federation. But in Russian language, we have two forms, Русские, ethnic groups, and Россияне, it's your citizenships. And people from Moscow and St. Petersburg don't understand why we are not agree to be Ruskiye. We very often try to say we are Россияне. And they like to answer, no, it doesn't matter. You are Ruskaya. And I think it's a very, very long discussion for us, but we should start this discussion. And my last point, very important, to say about take responsibility. I don't understand why Russian citizens don't ready to take responsibility for this war. We are Russian citizens and we should take responsibility. Doesn't matter your ethnic groups. Because I don't understand why some radical decolonial activists like to say, oh, we are victims of colonialism. We are just victims and we are not aggressor and we are not ready to take responsibility. I think it's a position of child and we should be adult. It's just my position. And we should be adult as like ethnic groups and people from Moscow and St. Petersburg. But now we are unfortunately more children than real serious people.
Alexandra, thank you so much. We have a question from Anna Gorshkova that is directed probably more to Pavel. She's saying, since most of the rural areas, or maybe it's not only to Pavel actually, but I think it's what I have in mind is more about the small numbered indigenous people. So most of the people small numbered peoples rely on agriculture and hunting for food supply. And so the question is, how does the lack of male population affect farming, food supply, food access in those areas? And I would like to add to it also the question of how does it affect, actually, you alluded to it in your remarks, but perhaps you can expand on it a little bit. How does this disproportionate drafting from these small numbered peoples affect the long-term ability of these peoples to of their culture and languages to survive? Because as you mentioned, they're very, very small. Taking away even just a few people already has an impact. So what does it do also culturally and linguistically?
So in the very beginning, as I've mentioned, unfortunately, many small indigenous nations are on the brink of extinction. And this war, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and the drafting of men from these communities, it's pushing these small nations towards the brink. Deer breeding is in one of their traditional industries, and to do this, it has to be your life. You cannot simply come from a city and learn. It's something that you do your whole life. So if you take deer breeders from that industry, the industry itself, the craft disappears, and the culture, the language, all of this disappears. And because of the small numbers, the probability of extinction is rising very rapidly. So unfortunately, this war, this aggression and its consequences will feel them for years in the future. And unfortunately, it might well lead to the disappearance of entire cultures. I did have a discussion with the academician Tishkov some time ago. So he said that, well, we've been talking about small indigenous nations disappearing for 100 years now, and you're still here. You have not disappeared. That's what he said. And this conversation keeps going. That is true, the conversation about our small numbers. But never, not in the Tsarist times, not even in the Soviet times. And those were difficult times. Never did they try to undermine the cultural foundations of indigenous lifestyles. Never have they taken our fishing lands, our hunting lands. During the Soviet times, I'm not even touching the Tsarist times right now, but during the Soviet times, there was legislation that stipulated that you have hunting and fishing and deer lands. And when you decide who gets what, the first people in line would always be small indigenous nations of the North and Siberia and the Far East, then everyone else. Science objectives, business objectives. But first you look if you have indigenous communities in the region, and they will always have a priority to have access, to own and have access to those lands. After the reforms of independent Russia, the reforms of the Putin regime, those clauses disappeared from the Russian legislation. During the Soviet times, those lands for the herds, for the deer herds, but also for hunting and fishing, would be given to indigenous communities forever and without pay. So they would be given indefinitely. But now, the indigenous nations can only hire those lands for their herds or for hunting on a commercial basis. And most of those lands now no longer belong to indigenous communities. Many years ago, at the Congress of Indigenous Nations in Russia, I did make a statement that there is now a new form of serfdom for the indigenous communities. There would be some kind of guy coming to your community saying, here's my document, and I do have the right to all of your lands. You can stay here, but everything you grow, everything you hunt belongs to me. So now that the communities are deprived of their lands, so the fishing, the herding, the hunting, the lifestyle is disappearing. And this is what leads to people ending up as criminals and abusing alcohol. And my final note is that this indefinite free of charge use for indigenous nations was taken away from indigenous nations, but the Russian Orthodox Church still has the right to take lands in Russia into indefinite free of charge use. Thank you.
Pavel, thank you so much. And unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. I want to thank our audience members for joining us today and for asking such insightful questions and incisive questions. Thank you again to Nina Rozhanovskaya, who translated for us so beautifully today. Please do visit the Canon Institute website to stay up to date with our upcoming events, publications, and podcasts. And we look forward to seeing you next time.